Hi everyone, welcome to Module 2. This week we're going to cover trait theories. So if you give me a second, let me share my screen. All right, should be loading. Let me go to full screen. So what do I mean by trait theories? Well, it's important to note, as I mentioned in the introduction, that this is probably the most common theory that you already have been exposed to without realizing it. Essentially, what trait theories entail is that this is a way to describe individuals' personality through words and adjectives. So if you think about it already, how would you describe a friend to someone that doesn't know them? You're going to be using traits, whether that person is fun, reliable, smart, creative, all those are a description of trait theory. This is one of the most common theories of personality, and as we progress to other of the theories, you'll see that many different clinical theories utilize trait as some sort of foundational component to explain their model. For example, analytical psychology, also known as Jungian, you may be familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Those also have trait components. So when they're talking about extrovert, introvert, intuitive, judging, those are traits. And so why we're starting off with trait theory is this is going to be a foundation to the other theories that we'll talk about going forward. So to begin, we need to describe what traits are and especially explain the difference between a trait and a state. So from this model, traits are they're relatively stable human characteristics. So again, if we're describing a friend to someone, typically we're trying to explain this person and give an essence of who they are, and ideally there's going to be some stability to this. It can be defined as patterns and habits of a person. Again, so that's what trait theory essentially entails. We're describing what makes up someone, and we hopefully can predict how they're going to act in the future. So we're hoping that these patterns are rather stable. And really, traits can be seen as have or have not. So someone's either creative or not creative, or it can be on a spectrum. Um, so a spectrum could be, uh, I'm losing my, our extrovert and introvert can be on a spectrum with this as well. So again, traits can either be haves or have nots. Someone is athletic, someone is not athletic, someone is musical, and vice versa. Or it could be on a spectrum where we all could be more extroverted and less extroverted, or could be more intuitive and less judgmental, etc. Uh, in addition to the traits, we can focus on traits that are internally focused, so influences our behavior, or externally focused, describes and labels our actions. So, for example, an internal trait would be motivation or self esteem. Those influence from the inside out. So, if someone has high self esteem, that could influence how they act in certain circumstances. And external describes or labels our actions. So, funny, if someone is funny, others are laughing at their jokes. Again, that's more external. I'm trying to think of other external components. Care, if someone's caring, again, that's going to be more described through their actions. And so, really, we can describe someone's internal characteristics and external characteristics from a trait theory perspective. Now, here's states. So, again, traits are rather stable, they're going to be a pattern, and ideally, traits are going to exist no matter what the environment is. States, on the other hand, is going to be a behavior, emotions, thoughts, perceptions, experiences that are more fluid and depend highly on the environment and situation. So it's going to be specific to what's happening in the moment. So a way to understand this is think of altered states of consciousness. So, for those who have experienced hypnosis, mindfulness, psychedelic drugs, and other psychotropic medications, can influence different traits and perceptions, thoughts, and behaviors because of the state of the situation. So if someone's usually calm, collective, and maybe shy, through a hypnotic state, they could be maybe more extroverted, acting like a chicken, have all this charisma oozing out, etc., because of that moment. Same with mindfulness. If we someone who has traits, let's say anxiety or kind of a type A personality, in a mindful state, they may be demonstrating traits of calm, relaxed, etc. Even think of alcohol use. Alcohol can definitely influence personality traits. So we're going to have states versus traits. And this leads to the whole concept, well, if traits can vary depending on the psychological environmental states, are traits an actual thing? And this leads to, well, we'll get to it in the next few slides, but this leads to eventually the situation of the debate between the situationist and the trait theorist. I kind of jumped the gun on that, but that's going to be the slide after this. So overview of trait theory. Like I mentioned, this is one of the oldest theories regarding personality. It has existed throughout many cultures. There's historical, anecdotal references and oral traditions of describing elements of a person in some sort of classification to help understand and predict their behavior. So this goes back to the Greek humors that had this model that depending on the amount of fluid, whether it be phlegm, bile, blood, that the amount of those fluids could influence whether someone's more melancholic, whether someone's more agreeable, whether someone is more entertaining. The amount of fluids in the body from this model would impact personality traits. We can also see this with Ayurveda doshas. The different doshas can have different representations and personality characteristics. And then finally, what I think most people are familiar with is astrological signs. So whether one's a Pisces, a Cancer, a Sagittarius, all of those models have different personality characteristics attached to those signs. Again, this is essentially a precursor to trait theory. So again, we naturally explain others from a trait theory lens. The positives of trait theory, it's very good at providing a language. Already I've given examples that I could use the word calm, peaceful, entertaining, charismatic to help explain someone. And again, we already have models outside of psychology theories, such as astrology and the doshas in Ayurveda, to help classify people characteristics and how they feel, act, and behave. What is missing for the most part in trait theory, especially classical trait theory within the social sciences, it's not focused on providing an explanation, also known as etiology. Really, if we look at the history of how trait theory developed, it was kind of in response to psychoanalysis, which we're going to cover in Module 4. Now, again, the psychodynamics, which psychoanalysis falls under, those theories were really focused on why someone acts a certain way, what caused it. And there's a lot of debates on how accurate those theories are. Again, trait theory has a lot of connection to the behavioral theories, which we'll cover in Module 6. Those premise, the grounding philosophy of trait and behavioral theories of personality is essentially the idea that we don't care why we don't care the reason that caused someone to act this way. All we care of what's happening in the moment. And we don't care what's happening internally. We only care what we can observe and see. So we want to observe and see what's happening in the present. That's the most important thing, rather than focusing on possible reasons why they're acting that way in the moment, and also ignoring the possible internal mechanisms that are happening. The trait theorists are more interested in how do we describe someone in the moment. Okay. So with that, again, the limitations, we don't have an explanation, and we really don't have a detailed model of how growth and change can occur. We don't have a detailed model how growth and change can occur through trait theory, because again, it's so specific in the present moment. Okay, so I alluded to this earlier. Now, within this whole debate of trait theory, are traits more related to the person, meaning can they be stable and static over time, or is it in the situation? So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, trait theories all focused on the present, and that's what kind of allowed this debate to come up. If we're studying in the present, are these traits going to exist in the future? And so the trait theorists argue that behavior is greatly influenced by the person and rather than the environment per se. So the determination of behavior comes from the individual. And if that's the case, I can plug and place the individual in any environment, and there's a good chance that they're going to act the same manner. So from this element, that traits are stable and the person is going to be more important than the environment. So that's a trait theory standpoint. If I am someone who has the traits of being calm, cool, and collective, that ideally, no matter what the situation is, I'm more likely to be calm, cool, and collective. So the situationists have a different perspective. They argue that the environment determines the behavior rather than the individual. So they're more connected to the states rather than the traits. That the situation and the environment is going to have an influence on how one's personality is expressed. So depending on the context and a different environment, you're going to behave and act in a different way. So the situation is more important than the person. So again, the debate still exists. Are traits a real thing? This is very similar to the nature versus nurture debate that is very common in social sciences. So really, there's probably a middle ground. Yes, there is some stability in our personality, but no doubt, depending on situations, the intensity of the situation, as well as our own experiences from past situations, can present different personalities being presented. So, with this, real quickly, if you think about it, you probably act different. You probably act differently with different groups you belong to. So you probably act differently with family compared to friends, compared to coworkers or peers, compared to people you've just met, or compared to other people you've known for a long time. So in that circumstance, because of that difference in variations, is that because of the situation that may be influencing that behavior? And if so, what traits really do you have? Again, these are all deep philosophical questions. As we move on to the clinical theories, the big premise of those clinical theories is that you have multiple personality traits. You have multiple parts in you that are going to be expressed differently in different circumstances. So the clinical theories take the middle ground. As yes, traits do exist, and you have a cluster of them, and depending on the situation, that's clusters, also known as archetypes or schemas, are going to be more likely to appear. So again, this situation in-person debate is going to get rehashed once we get back into the clinical theories. Okay, so with this, when we are trying to understand someone's traits, their thoughts, feelings, actions, behaviors, we can take two different views, Emic and Etic. And I think I'm pronouncing those correctly. I've heard different variations of these words as well. So Emic perspective is we want to understand how the person views their own traits. Okay, so that helps us understand not only the internal perspective that the person's experiencing, but also helps us understand their own worldview and make sense of how they view the external traits that they present. So taking an Emic perspective is trying to understand how the individual perceives themselves. This could be simply done as we can give them personality tests, or we can even ask them, hey, how would you describe yourself? And so the thing with this is there's always going to be some sort of bias because we can maybe present ourselves in a more favorable light as well as more negative, right? Some people have a higher view of themselves, others have a lower view of themselves. Some are more critical, some are more forgiving. So with that, we can also add another perspective to get a more truer description of one's personality, and that's using an etic view. So an etic is observing one's traits outside the individual's perspective. So this would be describing a trait through observation. So let's say I'm trying to understand someone's personality. I can observe them acting in different situations. That would hopefully give me a good description of how someone behaves in a given moment. Um, and if we think about a real world application of this, his letter of recommendations or references is taking an etic perspective. Someone else is describing your personality characteristics with the hope that those personality characteristics are going to be relevant and present for the future job or situation that those references are relating to. So when we look at the assignment, the assignment for Module 2 is it's going to be both an emic and etic perspective. You're going to be describing yourself in 5 words. That describing yourself is the emic view. And then an observer, or aka an informant, is going to describe your personality traits in 5 words or 5 sentences. So again, that's someone else describing you. That's an etic perspective. So we have emic, you describing yourself, etic, someone else describing you. And that's going to give us more data to help understand and possibly have a more realistic understanding of one's personality. Okay, so real quickly, an important person to understand for trait theory is Gordon Alport. So one of the videos, the crash course video, talks about how Alport, the story goes that Alport met Freud, and Alport was telling a story of what he witnessed on, I believe it was a train or bus ride there, and Freud kept trying to interpret that the story Alport was talking about related to him on some level, rather than Alport was just telling Freud what he observed on the way to the appointment. So that kind of, the story goes, led to the framework of Alport more interested in taking personality at face value rather than trying to interpret personality, meaning that has some sort of meaning in the psyche or the unconscious. So Alport again was influenced by the behavioral and pragmatic movements of the United States, which essentially this idea is really keep things simple and really focus on what can we observe. And by focusing on the present moment and observation, that's probably the best way we could help understand trait theories. So with this, we don't need to really explain the development of the personality. Instead, we should focus on what is happening in the moment. And with this, Alport developed a 3-level model of personality. So again, what's really clear before I go into these concepts, really, I can't talk at all. The really clear thing I want you to take away from this class is that within us, we have various different expressions of personality, and that depending on the situation, more can be expressed going forward. In addition to this, personality doesn't always have to be static. There's going to be some traits that are rather consistent, but there's always a potential for growth and change. So with that being said, let's focus on the 3 trait levels that Alport discussed. The first is the cardinal trait. So that's our dominant personality traits. These are the ones that are going to be rather consistent depending on the situation and context. So again, if someone is kind and caring throughout multiple situations and different contexts, that's most likely a cardinal trait. So in theory, how one describes you, or how you describe yourself, in theory, okay, not always, but in theory, you're describing a cardinal trait. So these are dominant personality traits that most likely are going to be expressed throughout different circumstances. The second is a central trait. So central traits are found in almost every, I can't talk at all today. Okay, central trait. So these are characteristics that are believed to be universal and really are more emotional states, and are going to be seen depending on the situation. So essentially, they're emotions. feeling angry, feeling jealous, having moments of truth and honesty. So they're central traits that all of us are going to have experienced in some capacity. So we have cardinal traits. That's really our more dominant personality trait. Underneath that is our more central traits, mainly mostly emotional states that all of us have experienced at some circumstance. We've all experienced moments of jealousy, emotional pain, courage, fear, etc. Those are our central traits. And then finally, secondary traits are seen in very certain circumstances or situations. So, for example, let's say overall someone is very easygoing, goes with the moment, but in certain circumstances demonstrates a very authoritative or dominant trait. Let's say in a crisis situation. So we could have a parent that overall, for the most part, is very easygoing, lets the child kind of free roam, etc. But right when the child is about to enter a dangerous situation, boom, the very dominant trait of protection and kind of authoritativeness comes into play in order to protect that child. So that would be a secondary trait because for the most part, it's not presented only in extreme circumstances. So again, how this model works, cardinal trait, that's your dominant personality. It's pretty consistent over time. Central traits is essentially elements that we've all experienced being human, and it's going to vary depending on the circumstance. And then finally, secondary trait are elements of our personality that are seen in very certain circumstances. So really understanding all these levels helps us understand the person. So we can observe them from an etic standpoint of having these different circumstances and seeing what traits are expressed. We can also kind of ask someone, how do they act in certain circumstances from an emic perspective. So that's trait theory, or Golden Alport's trait theory. All right. So with that too, again, trait theory is a massive component that has various different elements. We step outside the psychology realm for a second, especially laboratory psych, we can use a real world application and we see trait theory quite a bit in what we call career assessments. So most likely you've taken a career assessment in your life. If not, there's probably going to be other opportunities for that to occur. So typically what career assessments are motivated to do is measure one's personality using a trait approach and then match those personality characteristics to an environment that fits those personality traits. So that's what we call the person and environment model. So certain environments, personality traits are going to be more dominant, more expressed, and we're going to match individuals who have those more dominant personality traits more consistently, and boom, we have a match. Well, the critique of this, as I mentioned earlier, personality can grow and change. So just because you took a career assessment a few years ago does not mean your personality is still the same. And also, we know that work environments tend to change too. So just because it was a good match at a certain point, that does not mean it will be a good match in the future. So how we develop these career assessments is a lot of research has gone into these assessments. So what they do is they take a work environment and they sample the people in those work areas. So they assess their personality. So using statistical analysis, they average what the typical traits are and then design those future career assessments based off those traits. So let's say I find I want to understand the traits of a certain profession. I would go there, interview all the professionals in a certain area, and then find out what questions could express those traits. So, for example, let's say we want to understand the personality traits of a carpenter, right? So, we would go to a place where carpenters work, we would do some personality assessments, and then we would find out from that research, develop some questions in order to figure out if someone is a good match for this. So some simple questions could be, do you like working with your hands? Do you like using math and measurements? Do you like cutting wood? Do you like finishing projects, etc.? Do you like having, are you more uh, go by the book, or are you more, fluid and expressive? So that can help us narrow down a particular match between one's personality and one's environment. So, but as I want to make clear too, whenever we're using personality assessments, understand there's always going to be some sort of bias or possible error. So, really, the best standard of practice is when you're given a personality assessment to reflect on the results. Does this fit who I am? I remember from my own experience, when I took a personality exam, it really kind of emphasized that I would be a good autopsy professional or work in be a mortician. And I don't like the sight of blood or the idea of really um, preparing a dead corpse for a funeral. That does not appeal to me at all, one bit. So that was not a good recommendation from a career assessment. So really, again, the thing to remember is that we do not want to take career assessments as deterministic. And unfortunately, what happens quite a bit is career assessments are frequently used by personnel not adequately trained in utilizing and interpreting the results. So the biggest thing is we always want to reflect on what those results mean and understand that they're not deterministic and there possibly could be some error. So with that as well, it's always important to remember that a lot of these career assessments that are used now are based off 20th century research, particularly research done from the 1940s to 1960s. As I'll talk about the RIASEC model in a little bit, and there's another, the strong interest inventory that was developed, I believe, in the 1920s originally. I may be off with that, but again, the big thing to know: a lot of career assessments research was developed 20s to the 60s, and so the world of work has greatly changed since then, and that some of our theories may not fit the new workforce. Okay. Oof, there was a lot there. So, shifting gears. Uh, the next few slides, I'm going to go over common trait theory personality measurements. The first is the RIASEC model. So this is a model that we see a lot of it in career counseling, in career development, and career assessment. So this is based on John Holland's work. It is a trait theory because depending on the test we use, we can come up with some sort of code that reflects at least 2 to 3 of these traits. So as we'll see from this code, RIASEC stands for realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. So when you take some sort of assessment, for example, there's a free assessment through the Department of Labor known as ONET. And when you take this, you're going to get some sort of code. You get this code, and then you can use this code to find what occupations match these codes. So, for example, if I get social, artistic, or investigative, there's going to be a list of codes, a list of occupations that connect to those codes. So, for example, that could be a social scientist, a psychologist, an educator, and then vice versa. We can find these. I'm losing my train of thought. All right. So anyway, that's what the RIASEC model is. If I go to the next slide. All right, RIASEC model continued. So each of these letters represent some sort of personality trait or traits. So they're descriptions of what someone's going to do or likes to do in regarding some sort of work / occupation. So the R stands for realistic. This is also known as the doers. So someone who scores high on a realistic trait, they like to work with things. They prefer concrete problem solving over abstract theories. So ideally, someone in the carpentry field are probably going to score high on realistic. Investigative is the thinkers. So they like to work with data. They prefer individual activities versus group activities. So with an investigative trait, very common is some research scientists who work in the lab. Likes to work with data. And then we can see some sort of extroversion, introversion appearance as well. Likes to prefer to work with individual activities versus group activities. So artistic is a creator. They likes to work with ideas and things. More emotional decision making versus rationalistic decision making. Next, we have social. So that's helpers, like to work with people rather than work in groups that are individual activities. So what's interesting, let's say I have an SIA, right? So social states that I like to work with people. Investigative states that I prefer to work on my own and not work with people. So how do we deal with those two contradicting statements? Well, again, we could go from a situationist standpoint. It could depend on the people. It could also depend on the activities that I'm being asked to do. So it could be helping people, maybe in groups, but creating something or problem solving something could be individual or vice versa. So again, I'm using that example because I don't want you to take things deterministically, and also understand there's so much nuance with our own personality that we can have moments where we don't want to work with someone or work with people, followed by moments where we do want to work with a group or community. So it's finding that balance and understanding ourselves the best we can. There's going to be moments just in our own personality where there's contradictions. So with that, if let's say I'm SIA, or at least SA, where, excuse me, yeah, SIA, where times I would want to prefer to work alone, times I want to work into groups, it probably would be good to find a work setting where I have those options. Sometimes work alone, sometimes work in groups. So enterprising, also known as persuaders, like to work with people and data. So values include reputation, power, and status. Those are kind of their motivating factors. And then finally, conventional, those are organizers. Like to work with data and things, values, structure, self-control, and order. Okay. So the next model I want to go over, is known as the Big Five. So the Big Five is the most modern trait theory component we have. So when trait theory was first being researched in laboratories, some trait theorists were essentially going through dictionaries and thesauruses and looking at every way we could describe someone. And really since then, with those thousands and thousands upon words, people have been motivated to narrow those words into smaller and smaller categories. So one of the most common models is the Big Five, which utilizes some sort of spectrum. So depending on where one lies in that spectrum, we get some sort of profile to help explain that person. So the 5 characteristics that the Big Five utilizes is extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. Now understand that when someone is being assessed using a Big Five personality, it is exploring the spectrum of extroversion. So from extroversion to introversion, agreeableness, non-agreeableness, etc. Emotional stability to neuroticism. So with this, we can score from some sort of spectrum component. So if I score high in extroversion from this model, it means I'm outgoing, energetic, gregarious. Low would be more quiet, withdrawn. So I want to give a grain of salt with this. The definition of extroversion and introversion is going to change depending on the theory being used. For example, when we get to module number 4, analytical psychology, also known as Jungian, has a very different interpretation of extroversion and introversion. From that model, extroversion and introversion just means how do you regain your energy? When you're feeling depleted, what gives you kind of more like a boost? If you get more of a boost from hanging out with groups, that's extroversion. If you get more of a boost or feel more recharged from just kind of reflecting on your own self, maybe sitting with a glass of wine and reading a good book, that's more introversion. But from this model, extroversion, introversion just means, do you like people or would you rather be more withdrawn and quiet? So understand there's different definitions depending on the setting, or the theory. So as we can see, if we work down this model, using this spectrum element, we could classify individuals on where they fall on this level and kind of create a picture of, you know, who they are. Again, the Big Five is a really popular assessment that is used. It's highly well researched. There's some bias and criticism for this. Mainly, one component is that just within our Western society, extroversion is more socially acceptable than introversion. Um, and there's some debates that there could be a bias on the Big Five with this. Um, so yes, I'm trying to think if there's anything else with that. All right, so let's move on to the final very popular personality trait assessment, known as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, also known as the MMPI. So the MMPI is a highly popular and extremely comprehensive personality personality assessment. And traditionally, the MMPI focuses on psychopathology traits, also known as pathological traits. So it has a strong clinical component. We're trying to understand what flaws, mental health concerns, or personality dysfunctions one may have. So again, this is very pathological, very critical, and problem focused. And that's important to understand because the MMPI is very popular, and I'm seeing more and more job interviews, especially high level jobs, are using the MMPI to see whether or not one is fit to work in that setting. Depending, for example, some federal agency jobs require the MMPI exam, and again, I'm seeing more of this used in the corporate setting. So it's just interesting how that's becoming more common. And again, this also is used in the clinical setting, especially with more severe presentation of mental health concerns. So what's important to understand with the MMPI, it was originally developed in the late 1930s. So the foundational model of the MMPI, even though it's a trait theory, has a lot of influence from psychodynamics. And as I mentioned earlier, as we'll see, the clinical theories have elements or the foundation of trait theory and just add more of a causation of why those traits were developed and how those traits can be adapted and grow and change. So there's been multiple revisions of the MMPI, and one of the popular ones is the MMPI-2, and that consists of 567 true and false questions. It's a really comprehensive exam. It provides a lot of different suggestions and examples of possible personality traits. It can take a long time, and in order for one to ethically provide MMPI, they have to have years of training and at least, and for the most part, have to have gone to school in some sort of psychological discipline, and most of them have at least a PhD in this field in a social science field to implement the MMPI. So the MMPI again is used in clinical settings to help determine mental health diagnoses. Clinical and psychological research is used in legal systems quite a bit, and even in business settings to screen potential employees. So again, those just a quick kind of rundown of common trait theory assessments that are used. So the RIASEC model, we have the Big Five, and then finally we have the MMPI. So I'm going to end the slide there. Thank you for listening to my rambles. I really struggled with words today, so hopefully this was helpful in understanding trait theories. If you have any questions, please, see, I still can't talk. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.